signed up and have come through the doors of TEDxUChicago today. I want you to ask yourself if you would be here if 30 to 40 days ago you had to register at the TEDx University of Chicago registration board. And you couldn't do this on your smartphone, you couldn't do this on your computer, but you had to do it on a form that looked like a bad tax form. And in some places, for some of you, you couldn't even get your friend to give you that form. That would be a felony if they did that, in which they would face jail time for registering you to vote because they weren't deputized by the University of Chicago TEDx board. Imagine if you had to, from your dorm room, fill out that form in the right color ink, put it in an envelope, find a stamp, and send that in. And then a couple of days later, you might get back your TEDx University of Chicago registration form. And then for about 2/3 of you, in some places about maybe 85% of you actually, no one would tell you about this event. Because it didn't matter to you. So you didn't get an email, you didn't get a phone call, you didn't have a flyer put up on your part of Hyde Park or your part of Chicago or your part of the university, because it wasn't really about you. But for those of you that went through both of those first two steps and still found out that this event was happening, you would look at this cool paper. Maybe you pick up the Chicago Tribune, and right there it would say, TEDx University of Chicago will be likely attended. You will come. It will not be that interesting. And then for those of you that did all of that already and decided to come here today, when you got to the front door, there was a 2-hour-long line. So you stood out there because it's a beautiful day today. You waded through, and then you get to the entryway. And they ask, can I see your photo ID? And for those of you that are University of Chicago students who say, yeah, here's my University of Chicago ID, they say, no, not that ID, we need another ID. And if it's for Texas, your hunting license will do, but not that student license in order to get it. So you go back home to find a proper identification, and then you come back, wait another 2-hour line, and then you come in to listen to our speeches. But for some of you, there's not 10 speakers. There's maybe 2 if you're lucky. Both of whom spoke last year, both of whom said the same thing they said last year. I want to ask you how many of you would have sat here today or even come? This is our politics. In 2010, 126 million plus Americans who were over the age of 18 and eligible to vote stayed home. Did not vote. 126 million people. 126 million. Think about that. Did not participate in our democracy. Now think about who those people are. What do we know about who those people are? In the 2012 election, if you made over $150,000, your turnout was over 80%. Some studies say as much as 91%. If you made under $15,000, that was 40%. Our democracy is in serious risk. If you care about economic inequality in this country, if you care about everybody's voices being heard, if you want our politics and the things that affect you to matter, if you think it should matter for the diversity of our population, this should trouble you greatly. An oligarchy is what we're on our way to if this continues, not a democracy. 126 million people. I try to think about, what is that? Does it just happen? Is it just a fact? People don't care about politics, they just don't want to show up. Is that the reality? That's what a lot of cynics, what a lot of naysayers will tell you. I fundamentally believe that there's some truth, personal responsibility on this. But what we have done as a society, what we have done in the United States, is set up structural, systematic barriers that marginalize large sections of our population when it comes to our politics. And I want to talk about 3 ways that happen. Our laws and our system. That is North Carolina's 12th congressional district. That is a congressional district. We see this gerrymandering happening all across the country, Democrat and Republican, where elected leaders draw the boundary to protect their seats, to make it so we do not have competitive elections. In 2010, 15% of our congressional seats were decided by less, or around 10% or less. 15% of our congressional seats were even competitive. And a number of them, there's not even a second candidate running. This happens structurally. It would be like those of you just not having a campaign come talk to you because you don't live in one of the 15% of the competitive districts in the country, not to talk about our electoral college when it comes to presidential elections. We have systematically, through gerrymandering, marginalized large segments of our population. In addition to the gerrymandering that goes on, we have also marginalized folks through our voting laws. This year, already over 80 bills in local, state legislatures and state houses across the country have been introduced to make it more difficult for Americans to vote, to make it harder for Americans to vote. When 126 million aren't showing up, we are systematically trying to make it more difficult. More photo ID laws, fewer days in states where they have early vote, making it more difficult for people to register to vote. In North Carolina now, I can't just register you, I have to have somebody else with me to register you. It makes no sense. We are systematically, through voter suppression, marginalizing large segments of our population and creating a structure in which we're getting more and more economic inequality and less representation, and it is hurting our democracy. The other way, though, is not just the law. That's one piece of it. The other piece of it is our campaigns and how we run civic institutions in this country. Because of the gerrymandering, because so few places are competitive, we have campaigns that only focus on those places. But when they do focus on battleground states or battleground districts, you might know the term likely voter or unlikely voter. A likely voter gets pulled by a myriad of news organizations. Nate Silver and everybody else talks about the likely voter. The unlikely voter does not get pulled because they're unlikely. The likely voter shows up as a campaigner, as an organizer on my list. I call them, I knock on their door if I'm running a good campaign. I invite them to events with the candidate. I put them on lists targeted for digital advertising. I engage them in the political process. I try to make them a part of the democratic system so they can show up and vote. And hopefully, we actually have good candidates and competitive in that. The unlikely voter gets none of that. No one calls. No one puts a clipboard in front of their face and says, you registered for all this election. And so we run campaigns that just continue the same cycle. And that same likely voter, the same 126 million that didn't vote last time, get on the unlikely voter list, and no one talks to them in 2014 unless we fundamentally change the way that we run campaigns and the way that we run civic institutions outside of political campaigns in this country. And the last piece. So we have the structural barriers of the laws and creating this country that are making it more difficult for folks to vote. We have campaigns and civic institutions and an entire culture of running campaigns the traditional old school ward boss way that marginalizes further. And then finally, we have a public narrative that just makes all this worse. This is before the USA Today headline. Before the election in 2012. 90 million Americans will not vote in November. Before the election. And if you look at the headlines and the articles about 2014, it's all the same thing. It is a public narrative that everybody believes to be true. Young people don't vote. African Americans don't vote. Latinos don't vote. People who are poorer and have low information don't vote. And so that's just what we're going to write about in our narrative. Is this true? Not true. Luckily for all of us, it's not a fact. It is a public narrative that we fundamentally have to shift. And how do we know that it's not just a fact? We know that the laws and the structures and the way in which we run our campaign, and the narrative that we have is not fact. It is where we have come. How do we know that? Because we live in a country of states with different laws, with different campaigns, and with different public narratives. And when you look at the laboratories in the states, every one of these myths is shattered. Let's look at it. But first, let's think about something. When we talk about marginalizing, what could a new kind of politics look like? Well, it could look like an empowerment politics. An empowerment politics. A politics that's about investing with power and promoting self-actualization or influence. It's about giving power back to folks in their democracy to participate in. What does that look like? You don't have to wonder what it might look like, because it's happening today all across this country, where we have folks with laws that promote democracy, where we have campaigns that promote participation, and where we have narrative that doesn't already tell people what's going to happen. Let's travel around the country for a few minutes, and let's start in Oregon. I don't know how many folks here are from Oregon or know much about Oregon elections, but I just want to tell you a couple things about Oregon elections when you think about laws and how they change whether or not people turn out to vote. Oregon has online voter registration. Think about that. In 2014, they have online voter registration. What a novel concept. You can go online and register to vote. That's interesting because I just went online and paid my credit card bills and did all these other things that for most likely would want to make sure are accurate. And they figured it out in Oregon and Arizona and a bunch of other states, online voter registration. They also have vote by mail. Everybody in Oregon votes by mail. And you know what I don't have to do if I live in Oregon? I don't have to fill out a form saying I want to get a ballot and then get a ballot sent to me. I just get the ballot sent to me. And then I send it back in. And I vote. If I'm 17 years old in Oregon, they actively encourage me to get registered before I turn 18 so that I can start a habit of voting when I turn 18. And of course, I can't vote until I'm 18. But if the election is in November and I turn 18 in July, I get registered in February, and that's legal. And there's a myriad of other things that they do in Oregon to make it easier for folks to vote. The number one thing we can do with our laws to help solve the inequality gap at the ballot box is to have same-day voter registration. Why does that matter? Seems very in the weeds, campaign laws. Why does that matter? Think about it. If I have to register to vote 30 days before an election, and I have 2 jobs, and I get less information, and I am worried about all things going on, when I start paying attention to the election in a real way and start thinking about exercising my right to participate in my democracy, I've already missed the window. I can't vote in that election because I'm not registered to vote. In 2014, we can't get our act together in these states to figure out how to actually register and vote on the same day. There is no technological reason for that. Our technology is 100% there to protect the integrity of the vote. We just don't have the political will to do it in states, some states across the country, but we do in places like Oregon. And what do we see in Oregon? We see turnout that's 15% higher than we see in the rest of the country. In 2012, after the election was over, there was a poll done of Hispanic voters across the country, and they asked a simple question. Did a campaign talk to you? Did someone knock on your door? Did someone call you? Did a volunteer come to your door? That doesn't matter what party, and say, the election's this day, this is how you vote, these are all the crazy laws you have to get around in Texas in order, to go through in order to vote. Did anybody do that? In Colorado, around 70% of Hispanic eligible voters said a campaign came and tried to engage me in the democratic process. And the turnout of Hispanic voters in Colorado, over 60%. In Florida, they asked the same question. 70% of Latino voters in Florida said somebody came to my door, tried to get me ready to vote, tried to get me involved in the political process. What was the turnout of Hispanic voters in Florida? 70%. In Texas, the number of Hispanics who had been talked to by a campaign, 20%, 25%. Less than 30% of Texans who were eligible to vote, Hispanic voters, were talked to by any campaign. And what was the turnout? In the 30s. There is a direct correlation between campaigns, civic institutions, and our entire political culture reaching out to people bringing them into the political process. And it's it's not rocket science about how that happens. So we decided to start something called ballot insurance. Because what happens is this always happens in 2-year cycles. And all these states just get written off as not being competitive. So what we've done in Texas is start a campaign to go to folks now, to start registering them and get them engaged with 2.2 million African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans who are not even registered to vote today, but could be, and the millions more who are registered and not turning out. And that's happening in states across the country. We got to change our campaign. And the final thing we have to do is we have to change our narrative. In Minnesota, 75% of the voting eligible population voted in the last election. 75%. 75%. Now we're not quite getting where we could be, because I believe we could live in a society where nearly everyone votes. But why does Minnesota get there? Well, number one, their laws are great. They have same-day voter registration. They have a culture. But what's more important, they have campaigns like Welcome Action, all these things that have built up this sort of entire campaign culture, entire civic culture around engaging people in the political process. But the other thing is the narrative is fundamentally different, in part because of those first two things. The headlines in Minnesota are not about how low voter turnout will be. They're about how high it will be and whether or not they'll lead the nation again in the next election. Public narrative matters. If people think no one's coming to the party, no one comes to the party. If you thought no one was going to be here today, you wouldn't be here. But this place is full, and you're here. And you know what? You might come again, even if you've never been before, because you've experienced it. And that's what happens with voting. It becomes a habitual habit. And now I want to take you to South Carolina. But there's this amazing political event in South Carolina called the Jim Clyburn Fish Fry. It's a beautiful event. It happens after the JJ dinner, which is this very fancy, kind of typical political dinner that the insiders are invited to, where you can go to this fancy ballroom. And then the people come to the Jim Clyburn Fish Fry. It's held in a parking garage. No joke. All the presidential candidates come there. I'm there in 2007. All the presidential campaigns, they come, each candidate, they're all there, they all talk to a bunch of people. You get there, you get fried fish, you get your Bud Heavy, Budweiser, no Bud Light, Bud Heavy. And you listen to these candidates speak, and they have, basically the worst mic system you could imagine. You can hardly hear them, no one knows what's going on, but you go there and you listen to it. And I'm standing there, and I'm working on Barack Obama's first campaign. I'm a field director in South Carolina. And this guy pulls me aside. And he's been working in the South for a long time. He's doing a lot of politics. He's working with one of our opponents. And he said, "I heard what you're doing now. I heard how you're in the barbershops and the beauty salons registering people to vote. And you've got this program. I heard that you're in the churches and you're engaging with these congregational pastors and talking to people about politics. I heard how you're registering people in these high schools. I heard how you're registering people on college campuses and engaging with the process. I heard how you're doing this in the South with African American and white folks together, not two separate campaigns. I heard how you're doing all this stuff to fundamentally change the way we do politics." And he patted me very patronizingly. He said, "But you know what? Young African Americans are not going to turn out to vote in a primary in January." He was the first person I called when we won. In that election, 27% of the people who voted had never voted in any election in their lives. 27%. We can fundamentally change our democracy. We can create more economic inequality. We can create more inclusion. We can continue to be a beacon for the world. But we are at a serious place with our democracy. And we will continue to go down a place where that 126 million just gets bigger if we don't all stand up. Not because you're a political professional. You can be a designer. You can be a farmer. You can be anybody to be involved in the political process to vote. And that's not enough. We also need you to encourage other people. Change the public narrative in your local communities. Get involved. Run for office. Change this. This will fundamentally change our country. We're at a serious place. This is not about whether you're a Republican or a Democrat. If you are an American and you believe in our future, you will fundamentally want to change our voting laws, the way we run our civic institutions and our communities, and the way in which our narrative, the way in which our public narrative is constructed. When we do that, we'll have true progress.